you very much for coming along. This evening we want to look at an issue that's really quite important in just the last month. It's come up in effect because of the collapse of American leadership on the international stage concerning climate change. In Hamburg, it became very clear that basically the United States was isolated. It wasn't the G20 meeting in Hamburg, it was the G19 plus one. And the plus one was the United States totally isolated from the rest of the world, the rest of the world's biggest economies. And in fact, particularly China and the European nations. So what we want to look about at today in particular is the role that China is now going to play, and what do we know about China and its stance towards climate? Well, the sad fact is we don't know a heck of a lot, and we're going to have to learn very quickly. We're going to have to learn Chinese, we're going to have to start to reach out to Chinese experts and Chinese scholars who are willing to talk to us and learn about China and climate. Because from Copenhagen to Hamburg, 2009 to 2017, there's been a huge change in international leadership on climate issues. And just in the last month, as I mentioned, it's become very clear that the US is backing off. Trump has made a decision to leave the Paris Accord, and in the process there's been international chaos over, okay, who's going to take the lead? If China is going to lead, where are we headed as a global community? What was China's role in the collapse talks of 2009 in Copenhagen? How does it view its role today? Well, these are crucial questions. So let's look at what happened in Copenhagen itself.
Right now, to be honest, it looks very pessimistic and it looks like a real betrayal.
It can't even be called a deal. It could be called a cop-out.
Over to the people. It's the only answer, you know. If we leave it in the hands of these people, the politicians, then, you know, it's runaway climate change for us.
It started with several hours of fantastically pompous speeches by world leaders pretending to be green and pretending to be concerned about the environment. It was just one after the other, maybe 40, 50 speeches. Everybody was expecting, hoping that Obama would come offering olive branches and money and ideas to break the deadlocks in the talks. In the event, he came up with absolutely nothing at all.
The question then before us is no longer the nature of the challenge. The question is our capacity to meet it. For while the reality of climate change is not in doubt, I have to be honest, as the world watches us today, I think our ability to take collective action is in doubt right now. No matter what happens here in Copenhagen, we think it is good for us as well as good for the world.
Well, it didn't turn out terribly well, and as it became clear by the end of the session, in fact, it was an absolute disaster, particularly for Obama. This was his first major international meeting, and it was a complete flop. He had already accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for his initiatives, but this turned up later to be an absolute disaster. And it turned out that people from around the world acknowledged this and basically roasted the whole process. Let's take a look.
A non-deal. I think a non-deal in just about every aspect of the work you can think of. A non-deal in the sense that it's not yet over. Non-deal in the sense that it doesn't really live up to any of the preconditions that we put up beforehand. I don't find it very fair in the sense that it's been cooked up by a number of big countries in a closed room without any transparency, without any civil society engagement in this building. I don't find it legally binding. Why don't I find it legally binding? Because it isn't legally binding.
What's on the table from this cluster of countries is a betrayal of the poor the betrayal of vulnerable countries, a betrayal of small island states, and it's a betrayal of the future of all children and our grandchildren on this planet.
Well, this is the kind of condemnation it received, ending up with a roasting of the U.S. major envoy, who made a rather major mistake, as you can see from his coverage here on the main plenary stage.
We absolutely recognize our historic role in putting the emissions in the atmosphere up there that are there now, but the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I categorically reject that. We absolutely recognize our historic role.
This is so extraordinary as a statement that it deserves repeating here, so I'm playing it again. Notice the leap of logic. We recognize our responsibility, our historic role, he says, but no responsibility. We have this historic role. We know we did this. We expended the carbon that the rest of the world now has to cope with. But the idea of guilt or reparations or any of that, totally outside his concern. Take a look. I mean, it's really staggering. We'll play it again.
We absolutely recognize our historic role in putting the emissions in the atmosphere up there that are there now, but the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I categorically reject that.
Here in Copenhagen, the U.S. has rejected calls for the payment of climate reparations to poorer countries for the devastation wrought by global warming. Reparations advocates say the U.S. and other industrialized nations owe a debt to poorer countries for the effects of decades of emissions. On Wednesday, the lead U.S. negotiator, Todd Stearns, said he categorically rejects the principle of climate debt.
Okay. Well, this is what became the subject of exchange with the lead Chinese negotiator, who is really quite categorical in his response.
I don't want to say the gentleman is ignorant. He's very well educated. I think he lacks common sense when he made such a comment vis-a-vis funds for China. Either lack of common sense or extremely irresponsible. To look very carefully.
Unusually blunt language that coming from China's vice foreign minister. More so because the person at the receiving end is the chief US climate negotiator. But as the two major powers wrestle it out on various issues, the tempers are running high.
I think the particular comments were a bit unfortunate, but let me say I know Hu Yafei, and I actually have enormous respect for him. He's a smart and very effective Chinese official.
Right. And it was a matter of some humiliation that the head U.S. negotiator was in effect talked down by the head Chinese negotiator. Well, what was China's actual position in Copenhagen? As it turns out, a woman named Lucia Green-Weisko attended a lot of the conversations behind the scenes with the Chinese delegation and learned a great deal. Let's look.
We're also joined here in New York by Lucia Green-Weisko, who just came back last night, actually on the same flight that we came back through Reykjavik, Iceland. She is with the Beijing-based Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. Lucia, you spent a lot of time with the Chinese delegation. When Hillary Clinton gave her news conference on Thursday, just before Obama came into town, clearly targeting the Chinese, talking about the lack of transparency. Explain what was happening with China through these days.
Right. Well, first, just to say a little bit of background about China's position. China has been saying that these negotiations were a success, actually. The leaders have been stating that in the news. And the U.S. media has been saying that if there's anyone to blame in these negotiations, it's China, because it was resisting this transparency issue that Hillary Clinton brought up when she came to Copenhagen. But many of the big issues that China is dealing with when it comes to climate change were not discussed at all in the negotiations by anybody. China, as we know, is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, overtaking the United States just in 2006. But on a per capita basis, China is still very low in its emissions. And also, 80 to 90% of the emissions that are in the atmosphere right now were put there by the United States and Europe, not by China or by the developing world.
Now, that's the crucial point. 85 to 90% of CO2 contributed to the atmosphere that's creating this global climate change crisis were put there by the developed world, United States and European countries. And China at this conference was saying, listen, we've got to keep that in mind, and there has to be some historic responsibility for this. Something which, again, the U.S. negotiator very clearly insulted everyone by saying no responsibility for that. So China's position was that it kept very strongly to that important phrase, common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, yes, we all have a common responsibility to address climate change, but there should be a differentiation between those who have contributed to it, its causes in the past, and those who are just beginning to industrialize now.
So China has attached itself to this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that language was in the Kyoto Protocol. China wanted that language to be also put into the Copenhagen Accord. And basically what that means is that because the developed world is responsible for the emissions that are in the atmosphere now, the developing world will respond to the ability that it's able. So that's a very important point that China has pursued throughout the negotiations at all levels of the Chinese delegation, but also the NGOs from China were saying that as well. So I think it's on that basis that China is saying this is a success, meaning we were able to stick to this agreement of having common but differentiated responsibilities. But that said, in the months leading up to the Copenhagen negotiation, leaders from China were saying that the United States needed to take very strong action. One of the Chinese officials said that the United States should pledge to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2020, which is obviously much higher than what Obama's pledged himself to. They also said that the United States should pledge 1% of its GDP to developing countries to help them mitigate climate change, and that hasn't happened either. So I'm sure that the delegation from China also seems very disappointed by Obama's commitments.
Okay, that's an understatement. Disappointed by his commitments and his lead negotiators insulting them, saying, no, we don't have any responsibility for the past. But what's this mean for the climate? Well, the climate continues to heat. You can't open a newspaper these days or hear a report around the world without realizing that the world is marching year by year towards a warmer climate. And that's very visible from the different recordings of scientists all over the world, and it's built up in recent years to the point where it's getting quite pronounced. You'll see the orange colors become more pronounced, especially around the polar regions, but in the middle latitudes as well, as we get into the 1980s, the 1990s, and then after 1990 up through, this is through just 2012, it's extraordinary, the heat that's taking over, and it's visible from anyone who wants to look at it. You can see where it's coming from in large respects. It's coming out of China, the CO2 emissions, and these have been looked at too. It's what it looks like from space. It also has built up since 2009. Take a look at the record here. This was 2008, 2009, 2010. This just keeps going up, this raft of different measures, and the lines that summarize them here, they're not changing direction at all. 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, we are now above the 400 parts per million. After the failure of Copenhagen, finally Obama realized that he needed to make a deal with China. And he actually got Secretary of State Kerry, who replaced, remember, Hillary Clinton as Foreign Secretary or head of the State Department, and he got Secretary Kerry to hammer out a deal with China, which they both signed, and it was a historic deal, a milestone in the global fight against climate change. The idea was that if the two biggest polluters could come together, they could bring the others together. Now, China has a long history of being committed, though, to growth in its economy. And it's not about to be slowed down at this point. Take a look at the history here.
The Grand Buddha in the town of Leshan in China's Midwest, a civil engineering triumph 1200 years old, a tourist site today. From advanced irrigation schemes to its early invention of printing, China has been a huge economic power. If you take a really big view of history, you actually find that China's normally been about a quarter of the world economy. It was producing a quarter of world output 2,000 years ago. It was about the same 1,000 years ago. And by 1820, it was actually about a third of the world economy. In fact, the last 200 years have really been an historical aberration, with China falling behind Europe because the Europeans industrialized first. So now, China's reinstating itself to its natural position in the world, and that means industrializing.
Okay, its natural position in the world for thousands of years has been a quarter to a third of the world's economy. It fell behind, according to this commentary, because of industrialization of Europe first, but that industrialization is now happening rapidly in China, so rapidly, in fact, that when it dips a little, it takes on some sense of urgency in China, as it did at the National People's Congress.
China's economy is slowing down, but with rates that most other countries would envy. Projected growth for this year is in the range of 6.5% to 7%, which is down on 6.9% last year.
Well, those are enormous rates of growth, and they have also reinstituted or I should say they've repeated...
This is Marketplace from APM. I'm Kai Risdal. We were telling you the other day about the Shousanwu, that is China's 13th five-year plan.
The 13th five-year plan has, among other things, repealed the one-child policy.
Plan. Shousan is 13, Wu is 5. Anyway, we were telling you about it in the catchy earworm music video that state-run media over there put out. That was all in good fun, but there is actual news from that planning process today, changing the rules that have been mostly in place for 40 or more years. The government has announced it's getting rid of the one-child policy.
And getting rid of the one-child policy means that there's going to be a new commitment to domestic growth. Now, at the same time, there's been a total direction change by the United States in just the last 2 months, June and July. U.S. has decided to pull out of the accord that Obama spent so much time with Senator Kerry and Secretary of State Kerry forging with the Chinese. The world leaders are dumbfounded by this, and they condemn the U.S. withdrawal. Kerry calls it a self-destructive decision. And as it turns out, in July in Hamburg, the US and the UK were isolated entirely by the others, and it's China and Germany that are re-emerging. Now in that, it's clear that the G20 don't agree anymore, and there's a huge chasm between the G19 and America. What do we really know about China? Not a whole lot yet. And we have to learn fast. There are some academic programs like the Harvard-China Project. There are other government policy programs like the China Environment Forum down at the Woodrow Wilson Center. But what do we know in the public about this? Occasionally we see reports on China overtaking America in renewable energy, but we also see reports like China's other big export is pollution. So where are we, and where are we about to head? Well, the question, what do we know about China and climate, is really not very much yet. We basically need some very quick tooling up of Chinese scholars and American scholars who can start to talk to each other about these things. We need a new kind of citizen science alliance